The important thing is at the end of the day, when you cross that finish line, yes, it's exciting to say that you ran a marathon, but the thing that's everlasting is all of those little promises that you made to yourself along the way that you kept, and the integrity that built up. Because I think so many of us are really good at keeping the promises we make to other people, and we're really bad at keeping the promises that we make to ourselves.
The banyan tree is a tree unlike others, a representation of resilience and strength through its ability to overcome the status quo and fulfill its purpose.
It knew that it was meant for something bigger and didn't allow the limits of other trees to confine its growth.
And our story looks similar. I'm Leslie.
And I'm Mindy. And our hope is that every one of our listeners learns to take up all the space they were created to, just like the banyan tree.
Welcome back to the Banyan Effect podcast. We are coming to you today from the same room. This is the first time we've done this in a while.
It's been a long time, but it's fun.
I agree. Normally we're each in our home offices, and sometimes it's a lag. So I'm kind of excited to be able to read your body language today as we go through this podcast.
It's true.
Okay, today we are talking about something called imposter syndrome. And some of you may have heard what this means, others maybe not, though I bet when I describe it, you will say, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. So imposter syndrome is really, I guess we call it a syndrome, but really it is when we are not recognizing our own strengths and thinking that we are overqualified or in a position that we don't deserve. And I know, at least from my experience, that a lot of women struggle with this thing called imposter syndrome, whether we don't believe we're worthy of what we have, or it keeps us from going after bigger goals and dreams because we think that we're not capable. Imposter syndrome is basically the thing that prevents us from doing that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to start the episode with just a story of my own imposter syndrome. And I think this will help just put some context and a real life example around how this comes to life. My own imposter syndrome is in the workplace. I am in an executive level marketing position and often find myself feeling like I am not the one that deserves to be there. And I look around at other people in the room and think, wow, how did I get here? And sometimes I think in my role, I need to provide a lot of leadership and a lot of strategy and a lot of vision work. And it's less of the doer role. And in my life, strategy, what I've learned now is strategy has always come really easy for me. It's just sort of a natural quality of I have the ability to put a complicated puzzle together and come up with some really cool ways to reach a goal. And so that's something that comes really naturally to me. And because it has come naturally, it's allowed me to do well in the position that I'm in. But I often look around at the skills of people around me and think, I can't do that, or I don't lead like that, or gosh, I don't know anything about digital marketing. What am I doing here in this role? And imposter syndrome is really me shrinking my own strengths and saying that I'm not worthy of the position that I'm in because I'm not recognizing those strengths in myself. So imposter syndrome can show up like that. Or again, it can show up in ways of not going for maybe that dream job because you feel like you're not capable of doing it. So that is just a real life example of imposter syndrome. And today on the podcast, we're going to dissect how to recognize it and how once we recognize it, how we start to change that way of thinking.
Yeah, because I think imposter syndrome is one of probably the more common reasons that people stay stuck or they stay in their comfort zone, because what happens is we have this idea, or there's this desire planted inside of us, and typically if there is something planted inside of us, it scares us, as it should, because it's calling us to grow. And a lot of times imposter syndrome is that thing that keeps us. It tells us, it's this little voice inside that tells us that we're not worthy, like you said, or not good enough, or we don't have the skill set. I think that's a really big one that I see in, for an example of my industry, agents get licensed and they're excited and they want to do this thing. And then imposter syndrome steps in and says, but you don't have the experience and you don't actually know what you're doing. And you've never closed a house, or maybe you don't even own your own house. And those are like all of these things that imposter syndrome tells us to make you, like you said, shrink back and stay where you are and stay in this comfort zone. And that is just not at all where we're called to live and stay. So it's something I think is so important to constantly be aware of and keep your eye out for when it rears its ugly head.
Yeah. When we were planning for this episode, we were talking about the book called The Big Leap. And it's one that we both have read. And in it, it talks about, I always call it the upper limit threshold, but I don't think that's it. He calls it the upper limit something.
I think it's just the upper limit.
The upper limit. So the upper limit is essentially talking about how we operate in between, let's say, B and C. And we kind of stay in between there forever. And as soon as you get to the top of C, ready to cross over into D, you go into an area that is unknown, you're not familiar with. You start at the beginning again, right? We all become masters in our craft, and then you expand into the next one, and all of a sudden you're in an area where you don't know everything again. And that's a really hard space and scary space to be in. But imposter syndrome, I think, keeps us from having the confidence to burst through that upper limit threshold and go into the next area of learning or growth rather than staying in that threshold that we're used to.
Yeah. And so we're talking about the imposter syndrome in your work environment. And, I think that I never would have got to where I am in my career if I would have obviously listened to imposter syndrome. But I always say that in real estate, like from day one, I was ignorance on fire. And so I didn't let imposter syndrome affect me at that time. Like I just was like, let's go. And I went, and I didn't stop to overthink anything. And maybe that's true for you too. Imposter syndrome does not have to be something that only shows up in your workplace. I think imposter syndrome can be one of the reasons that women or men end up yo-yoing when in their weight, because again, I think it does root from feeling worthy and feeling like you deserve it, and getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And if you don't figure out how to do that, you're gonna ultimately always do what you need to do to shrink back into that comfort zone again. And so maybe like it's, weight is another example. You hit a goal, weight, you lose the 10 pounds you've been looking to lose, and then imposter syndrome rears its ugly head and says, wait a minute, this isn't who I am. I don't deserve to look like this. I don't deserve to feel like this. And then what we end up doing is a lot of times self-sabotaging ourselves back into that comfort zone. You're working on your self-worth as you're stepping into these scary steps. And maybe it's career, but maybe it's health and wellness. Maybe it's, like we're trialing and erroring all these homesteading. We're like wannabe homesteaders right now. And so, the imposter syndrome could show up there. Like, well, I don't know how to garden, and I'm not good at it yet. So like that could be something where it's just like, that's a way that I will shrink back and be like, nope, I've never been able to be successful with it, nor that means I'm never going to be. And so it can really show up in any area of our lives.
100%. I think another area that it shows up in is not only that upper limit threshold concept that we're talking about right now, where you're scared to take the next step because you're not recognizing the value that you could bring to that, or you don't know how to do it. So you stay in that comfort zone. I think another thing is not having the self-reflection and self-awareness of where your strengths are. Sometimes our strengths come so naturally to us that we don't even recognize that they're strengths. So I always feel like if you are in a place where you are scared to take that next step, or you're not learning something new because it's outside of your comfort zone, like you've got to almost take a step back and recognize, well, what are my strengths? And sometimes they could be really uncommon strengths, right? Like I don't have a strength in, I'm trying to think of something common. Like I'm not a triathlete. That's a strength that everybody recognizes as a strength. But there are a lot of strengths I think that all of us have in our day-to-day life that aren't necessarily recognized as strengths. So in my case, the ability to be strategic and problem solve isn't an obvious strength, especially if it's stuff that comes naturally to you. So I think like taking a step back in those instances and recognizing that having and recognizing your strengths to overcome your imposter syndrome isn't just looking at like, oh, I can run a marathon, or I'm a triathlete, or I'm a CEO. Like it can be these sort of intangible strengths as well.
Yeah. And I know you recently were able to sort of shed some light on strengths because somebody else called them out to you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that's a really important thing to consider is if there's something that somebody consistently tells you you're good at, pay attention to that. Because maybe it doesn't directly affect what you do for a living or how you make an income or, whatever, but maybe there's room for that. Maybe there's room to incorporate that into either what you do or what you should do in the future or dreaming about doing. But I just think paying attention to other people's observations when anybody says like, well, you're really good at this. Can you help me with this? That's a really good thing to recognize and acknowledge and just maybe spend some time with.
Yeah. That just made me think of an earlier podcast that we had. We talked about a book. Gosh, I can't remember the name of it. It was the one that Jen Gottlieb wrote. Be Seen. That's what it was. And it was the very beginning of her book was talking about finding your purpose. And she said, just pay attention to the everyday things that you do that you just get lost in, that feel really easy and you can't get enough of. And that's your purpose. Start to lean into that. And this sort of reminds me of that, of like, pay attention to the comments that people make to you or the things that people are asking of you. And maybe that is your strength starting to show up that you didn't realize was there.
And I think, talking about putting puzzles together, I think that so many of the things that we talk about on this podcast are these little like banyan roots, we like to call them in our private conversations. But it is ultimately all of these pieces. Like we have this desire in our gut. We have this inkling. We have this feel that we want more. Then we start to pay attention to the things that people that admire about us or recognize about us that maybe we didn't recognize. If you spend some time thinking about all of these little puzzle pieces, like it's all for this bigger purpose of helping you figure out who you were created to be and how to take the next step to step into that person, because none of it's an accident. We have to spend some time paying attention to it.
Yeah. And I think all of that is wrapped up into this phrase of imposter syndrome. But you think about the power of doing what we're talking about right now, of recognizing these strengths, really paying attention to them, and not just saying I have this strength, but feeling that strength and believing it and having the self-worth and the self-confidence. It's like the power of overcoming your imposter syndrome is literally the thing that's going to get you to reach those goals that you're setting or that vision that you have in your head. We've talked about that. Like, I see this person that I want to be 5 years from now. Like, we've got to get over that imposter syndrome of feeling like we can't be that person. Like, we have to manifest that person in our life. And if we are allowing imposter syndrome to constantly step in and say that I'm not capable of that, and we're always planting that seed through something like imposter syndrome, we aren't going to reach that version of ourselves 5 years from now.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of how our house came to be, like how we ended up building this house. Is I had a dream, and then imposter syndrome showed up a million times when we were building our house. But the way that I took the first steps is I just started letting myself dream about it. So it started as like, well, where would it be? And what would it look like? And what color would it be? And all of this stuff. And then, long story short, we ultimately ended up, purchasing the land and starting. And then all of a sudden it was like, who am I to build this beautiful house? And imposter syndrome, I'm telling you, has maybe never shown up in my life as much as it did while we were building our house. And the way that I kind of got through that is I started asking myself questions. Well, what does the woman that you believe deserves to live there look like? Like, what does she do? What are her habits? What time does she go to bed? What time does she wake up? Like everything and anything. I like micro dissected this person that I thought did deserve to be in that house. And I started doing the things that I thought that she would do. And so as we were building this house, I was building myself. I was building my confidence and my belief that I deserved it and I was worthy of it and all of these things. And ultimately, I look back and yes, we built this house, but at the same time that we were building this house, I was building myself. I was creating and starting to walk in the steps of the person that I wanted to become. And I think part of that goes hand in hand with confidence. You brought up self-confidence, and I think that's a really big part of it. So what I was doing as I was practicing what this person that deserves to have this house, what I was doing is I was giving myself confidence by starting to act and talk and do and all of that stuff like that woman would. And I think that sometimes in order to gain some of that confidence, especially if you're someone who's starting from scratch, from like ground zero, and that's an area that you really struggle with, it sounds really cheesy and corny, but asking the people around you, the people that know you the best, maybe some really trusted colleagues or friends, family, whoever you really trust, ask them what they see your best attributes are. I mean, when we try to break down the tasks involved in running a podcast, we said to each other, like, well, what do you see me doing best? And what do I see you doing best or whatever? And, for example, you had said, structuring the content or putting the outline together for an episode. I don't know that I would have necessarily said, oh, I can own this piece because I'm good at this. But then you telling me that you thought I was good at it gave me the confidence that I needed to step into that role and and take ownership of it. So if you can like find just a little bit of confidence, borrow confidence from somebody who knows and loves you well, that could be just the very first step that you need to start taking some of these action steps.
I really, really love your example of building the house because, I mean, I think about the women in my life who I've had conversations with about imposter syndrome. It is always something that is in their next upper limit threshold, right? It's like something that they don't know yet or they're not good at, and they're constantly telling themselves like, I don't have this skill to do that, or I don't have enough experience doing this before I can get into that role. And so I love that example of if you can just flip the script a little bit of like, okay, well, what does the woman in that role have then? And I'm going to start doing them. And so maybe you really don't have the experience to be there yet, but you start to build that in the process. Or maybe you start to recognize like, oh, I do have that experience. I'm actually really good at that. And so I am going to go for it. And so I love that. I love that flip like that. One statistic, and I don't know the exact numbers, but I do know that women suffer from imposter syndrome much more than males. And so I think about that of like, well, what's the difference in that? And I think we need to have that sort of like, I'm just going to go do it kind of attitude, and I'm going to figure it out along the way, which I think men can sometimes be better at than women. And so I think the house example is perfect of like, I know I'm just going to do it and I'm going to figure it out. And you did. And like you said, you became sort of this new version of yourself along the way too.
Well, and I didn't have a lot of times when imposter syndrome creeps in, we have the option to go back to our comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
Well, after we had signed all the paperwork and we're actively building this house,
Too late.
imposter syndrome showed up and I was like, I got to figure this out because I can't do my hands are tied. We're building the house. And so I had to figure it out and I had to work through it. And that was something that I talked to my mentor about. And, I think any good coach or mentor knows very, very well what imposter syndrome is and some techniques on how to get through it, or a therapist, whoever you need to talk to. I mean, I have all of them. But that was one of the things, like, okay, well, what does that person do? And, again, all of the things. And then you have to start living it and doing it. And it ultimately, you end up accomplishing or obtaining or, getting whatever it is that you desired, but it's also the person you become as you learn how to power through imposter syndrome that is going to be what takes you all the way to like the heights of the heights. Cause I just feel so deeply that like, if there is any sort of dream or desire planted in your belly, like you didn't put it there. It was put there by design, by your creator because it's your destiny. And you can choose to be scared of it and be fearful, or you can choose to grow in the way that you need to in order to get there. But the desire, the feeling in your gut, it's never going to go away. It's like the marathon for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not going away.
No.
You got to just go after it.
I know. So I started recently, again, training for a marathon. It's a 24-week plan, and I'm on like week 7. I skipped the first 4 or 5 weeks. They felt a little too easy. So I started like a month in, and I can feel imposter syndrome creeping in right now big time, because every single day I have to battle with my inner head that I have to go out and do this run. I'm like trying to make excuses in my head of why it's hot, or it's humid, or it's sprinkling, or whatever. There's always something inside of me that's saying you can't do it today. And that, talk about imposter syndrome. Like I don't see myself as someone who can complete a marathon, but I need to prove to myself now that I can complete this marathon. And I think part of that is following through on that promise. I had tried to run a marathon years ago, and during COVID, a tumor on my spinal cord reared its ugly head and sort of knocked me out flat. And any sort of marathon training obviously wasn't the priority at that point. But that was 4 years ago now. And so it's been this nag in the back of my head ever since of, you wanted to run a marathon and you couldn't do it. And so I've been reliving sort of that talk to myself for a long time. And ultimately it did get to a point where I was like, I have to prove to myself that I can run a marathon. Otherwise I am going to get to be 80 years old and I'm going to be mad at myself that I never did that. So I think the other piece of battling this imposter syndrome is following through on these little promises that we make to ourselves. And they don't need to be as big as running a marathon. It could be as big as, I'm going to get up at 6 a.m. and go for a walk tomorrow morning, and making sure that we're following through on these little things that we're telling ourselves. So we're not constantly planting that seed that we can't do something that we're thinking about.
Right. And because the important thing is, at the end of the day, when you cross that finish line, yes, it's exciting to say that you ran a marathon, but the thing that's everlasting is all of those little promises that you made to yourself along the way that you kept, and the integrity that built up. Because I think so many of us are really good at keeping the promises we make to other people, and we're really bad at keeping the promises that we make to ourselves. And that piece of integrity that we need for ourselves is one of the things that will help you power through imposter syndrome. Because just like with the house, like I had to keep showing up as that person that I thought deserved to live in the house that I was building, because I had to get there. And you have to get to the end of the marathon. And so by the time you get there, you will have shown yourself that you will and you can and you do keep promises that you make to yourself. And that is just, again, that is such a huge tool for us to put in our tool belt as we are trying to become these people that we feel that we want to become, that we feel like we were destined to become. So
yeah,
the marathon's great, and you picked a really good medal, like we talked about. So that's the important thing. But it'll be, I've talked about that too, like planning runs just so that I can follow through on something and show my own self that I can keep the promises that I make.
Exactly. Yeah. And I was just thinking about like how we can take credit and celebrate those small wins along the way. Like we're winning every single day. I have a friend who has major imposter syndrome and she openly talks about it. But I see her also giving a lot of credit away to other people when they are her wins. They are her things. And so she's constantly shrinking herself while she's building others up. And she's developed this really severe case of imposter syndrome in the meantime. And so I look at her, I'm like, if you could recognize the huge strides that you have made in the last 5 years and all of these wins, like if you could look back at the woman that existed 5 years ago and the one that existed now, you built her. And so I think we have to be giving ourselves credit along the way too when we do have these little wins or when we do learn something new. Like, I think it's easy to give the kudos or recognition away to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't know how relevant this necessarily is to imposter syndrome, but bear with me. I recently saw this meme that said, you need to impress 2 people in life. And it is, I don't remember the age specifically, but it's something like your 9-year-old self and your 99-year-old self. And I absolutely loved that. Again, I don't know if it's relevant to imposter syndrome, but it just reminded me of what you were kind of talking about. So that's just an extra bonus nugget for you today, because I absolutely love that. Because if we do look at the 9-year-old version of us and you think through her eyes and what she would see, because she's not going to see what you see at your current age. She's going to see like, wow, you're like a big career person and you have a beautiful house and you have kids and dogs. Like, she's going to be just like elated and like, I can't wait to be that person that you are right now. And then, so that like part excites me thinking about the 9-year-old version. Cause I'm like, oh, I think she'd be like, oh, you're cute. Like, cause I remember growing up thinking like, once you had kids, you had to get like grotesquely fat and wear muumuus. Like that's what I thought parenting was. Like, okay, you have a baby and then you go into,
they're cute.
Then they're cute.
Take all the cuteness.
And you are 100 pounds overweight for the rest of your life and you wear muumuus all day, every day. Like that's what I thought when I was young. So I'm like, oh yeah, like she'll be good. But then I think about the 99-year-old and I'm very intimidated. Because I'm like, ooh, she would not like how much time I spend on social media. Like I start to think about like the ways, and I think it aligns with like the person you want to be and starting to adapt those activities and all that stuff. It does the same thing to your brain. Like, oh, she probably wouldn't like as many that I have that many cocktails when I decide to have cocktails, whatever. Like, it gives me a totally different perspective. And it also takes away these people that we in our brain surround ourselves with, and we think that their opinions matter, and they don't.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that we have is talking about overcoming imposter syndrome. Like that, thinking of your 99-year-old self, we'll just round up to 100. Thinking about our 100-year-old self, that she is not looking at anybody but current us. She is not looking at what the woman down the street is doing. She is not looking at what that person over there is doing or the thing that didn't happen here. Or she's not looking at any of that. And so I think about this constant analysis or comparison to other people around us and seeing their strengths and being like, oh, I don't have their strength. So I need to go do that. Or that person has that strength. I don't have that one either. And then you try to go get that strength. It's like, just stop doing all of that and recognize like our unique strengths and what they are and fuel those and build into those. We don't need to be all of the things to all of the people, because our 99-year-old self certainly does not expect us or want us to have or be good at everything.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I would say that she's not looking at is she's not looking at the mistakes that you made a year ago or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. She's, it's like this snapshot in time. And I think that's another reason that imposter syndrome can sneak up on us, is because we're thinking of our past mistakes and our past, like the lack of our follow through in the past, or, like maybe it happened for you and you're like, I want to run this marathon. And then this thought sneaks in like, well, you couldn't do it last time, or you didn't finish last time. Like that happens all of the time. And that's how imposter syndrome reinforces itself, is that like, yeah, that's true. Like I already tried that and it didn't work and I didn't do it. Like the 99-year-old version is not thinking about that, and neither should we. We need, like, the past does not exist. We are moving from here forward, and we are proving to ourselves that we can and we will and we do.
Yeah. Well, the can and we will and we do too reminds me of like telling ourselves these affirmations every single day. We are so good at planting these negative seeds in our head. I mean, I think as humans, we are more, it's like instinctual in us to be more negative. It's like a protector in us, or, a safety to protect us from predators. However, like we are not in that state. We don't need to be those types of humans anymore. And so we have to be really aware and really conscious of not planting those negative seeds, and instead planting these positive affirmations in our head that we are capable. And it sounds cheesy, but I mean, you see these little kids. I mean, if you watch reels or whatever, you can see videos of these little kids looking at themselves in the mirror saying, I am loved. I am smart. I mean, those affirmations, well, it's cute for a 3-year-old. We need to be doing that for ourselves too, of like, I am capable of getting that position. I am capable of running the marathon. I am capable of living in that house. And we have to believe it, like deep down to our core. And I think if we can picture ourselves as that 99-year-old woman, or even picturing yourself as like, okay, well, what does the woman in that position do? It allows us to not only plant the affirmations, but start taking action on doing the things that are going to get us into that position.
Yeah, I think we talked about affirmations last week. Have you started doing any?
No.
Me either.
No.
Okay.
Practice what we preach.
This episode helped me, and I am going, that is my homework between now and next episode.
What are your affirmations going to be?
I don't know yet, but that's my homework, is that I'm going to put together my affirmations. Because I preached about it last week and I admitted that I wasn't doing it, but I was going to, and I have not started. So
I need to do them. I think
same.
In the middle of, I'm like, after this episode, I have to go run my long run. I need to be telling myself these affirmations, because I'm not sure of a better time to start them when you're trying to run a marathon.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's all in your head, I'm learning. It is not about, I mean, it is physical capability, don't get me wrong, but once you hit a certain distance, it is all in your head.
It's all in your head, 100%. That's why I told you I have no desire. I can't do it. But I also, especially for you, if you want to practice your affirmations while you're running, a good friend of mine went into coaching a long time ago for a brief period of time, and she told me that there's data out there. Ask the Google machine if you, I can't promise, but she told me that our minds and our bodies listen best to our own voices. So if you really want to hammer some affirmations, that you should record them in your phone and you should listen to them, listen to yourself saying them to you, if that makes sense.
It doesn't make sense.
So
I cringe a little bit even listening to ourselves in these podcast episodes after they air. So I can't imagine trying to run and listening to myself on repeat. Yeah. It's like, shut it off. Quick, I can't
Maybe
listen.
just once or twice. I don't know that you have to listen to it for like hours, but.
Well, after this episode, I think we both learned that we need to take our own advice. We've both definitely had a case of imposter syndrome ourselves, show up in different ways, shapes, or form. And I really like the recognizing that it exists, and you have to be able to tell yourself that you are capable of achieving these things. So whether that is through positive affirmations, following through on something that you've always promised yourself, or picturing that 99-year-old woman and making sure that she's proud of who you are. I mean, all of these different tips and tricks that we talked about today can help us power through that imposter syndrome and go reach these goals that we think to ourselves every day, but then quickly tell ourselves that we're not capable of.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I wasn't prepared to say anything.
Okay, so Mindi, our homework, we both learned we both have to follow through on our affirmations to ourselves. So maybe when we come back next week, we can share the affirmations that we started telling ourselves.
Oh, that sounds
today.
vulnerable. Okay.
That's what this podcast is all about.
You're right. All right. Okay. Deal. Then I have to do my homework because it's going to be graded. Or it's pass fail, but
there's your type 3 coming out again, the achiever in you.
Yes.
I'll only do it if I win an award.
Yes. If I get credit. Done. Okay. Well, I know this, talking through this, even honestly, just going back and thinking about that practice that I went through when I was building our house, honestly helped me today. So I hope that you all out there feel that it helped you think about some steps that you can take to start going after that person that you were created to be. It's in your belly for a reason, and you got to start following that. And do not let imposter syndrome get in the way. So thank you so much for listening. If this resonated with you and you think of any other friend, family member, or person on the planet that could benefit from our episode, please share it with them. It's the only way for us to grow. We appreciate you being here with us, and we will see you again next week. We hope you have enjoyed today's episode and found some valuable insights. If you liked what you heard, we'd love it if you would hit the subscribe button.
We love hearing from our listeners, so drop us a comment, share your thoughts on social, or review wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback keeps us going and helps us bring you the content you want to hear.
As always, we appreciate your time and company. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and keep listening to the Banyan Effect podcast.